Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Boutet, and today we are debating the zero tolerance policy. We will begin with brief introductions and an overview of zero tolerance. Our debate will open with Kelly Kerner, who will argue for zero tolerance policies and will explain its history and effectiveness. Then Stephanie Hoekstra will argue against zero tolerance policies and will propose recommendations for alternatives. In support, Abby Hansen will be discussing the effects of zero tolerance by providing quotes, images, and videos. Tiffany Thomas will provide supporting research, and Crystal Gibson will provide clarifying questions through the debate. Thank you to everyone here today, and let's get started. So zero tolerance policies are policies that result in the mandatory expulsion of any student who commits one or more specified offenses. This could include things like guns or bringing weapons, sexual assaults, verbal aggression, or any combination of those. This emerged as a federal response to school violence. The main purpose for this debate is to determine the overall effectiveness of zero tolerance policies and also explore some of the supporting evidence. The main argument for zero tolerance is that it provides consistent consequences for dangerous behaviors in order to minimize disparities and deter students from committing these dangerous behaviors. Now, the counter-argument for zero tolerance is that there is insufficient evidence to support that it decreases dangerous behaviors. And in fact, that there are more evidence to support that zero tolerance has severe negative impacts on the lives of students beyond their educational years. There are many parts to this issue that make it particularly relevant. There is increasing research on zero tolerance that proves that insufficient outcomes to reduce violence or drug abuse and instead result in negative outcomes for schools and individuals. Zero tolerance also largely impacts racial minorities and males, also contributing to the disparities in race and sex. And there's emerging use of positive behavior support in schools. And there's new state laws limiting long-term suspensions and expulsions and eliminating use of zero tolerance policies. To open our debate, we're going to have Kelly Kerner, who's going to discuss zero tolerance and how it keeps schools safer by providing consistent punishments. Kelly?
Thank you, Derek. Zero tolerance policy provides a reliable consequence to deter students from committing a very serious and dangerous behaviors in order to ensure a safe learning environment for all students. I'm going to open up with a video to start explaining my side of the argument.
And this is from the Washington Journal.
Across this country, especially based on the last several years where we have had very violent acts in our schools, killings, I think there's a feeling on the part of the public. They want schools, of course, to be orderly and to be safe. And there's tremendous pressure on school principals to ensure that type of an environment. And in fairness, when you talk about guns in schools, there's no place for a weapon in a schoolhouse, and we should have zero tolerance. And there should be no place in a schoolhouse for drugs. We should have zero tolerance.
Okay, thank you, Abby. So Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about the history of zero tolerance policy?
Yes, that's a great question. The history behind zero tolerance is extremely crucial in understanding the importance behind the policy. So the ideology for zero tolerance was developed in the 80s. This was during the war on drugs, and it was to prevent drug trafficking and gun violence in the criminal justice system. Here's an image that shows the signing that Abby has for us. So this is President Clinton signing the Federal Gun-Free Act. This is when the ideology made its way into the school system in 1994. This act required all schools to expel students that bring guns into school for a minimum of 1 year and refer these students to the local law enforcement. We have our second image, which shows the expulsion laws being adopted by all the states. Abby, do you have any further?
Yes, this is according to the EPA. You can see by the graph there is an increase of states that adopted the laws across the course of several years, which you can see what type of laws they adopted it towards, and there's a drastic increase when this began, which of course is help protecting all of our children in school.
Thanks, Abby. So in 1999, the major tragedy hit America, the Columbine High School shooting. This is when 12 students and 1 teacher were killed by students Dylan and Eric. And in the Columbine shootings, they rank as one of the worst mass shootings in the U.S. history, as well as one of the deadliest episodes of school violence. Following the Columbine, zero tolerance expanded to include anything that could be perceived as a weapon, possession or use of drugs or alcohol, any sexually harassing or suggestive comments, making threats of violence in any form, or possession or use of laser pointer. Abby, can you tell us some real world experiences in which zero tolerance was applied?
Kelly. Yes, and actually some of the research, according to the St. Petersburg Times, there was a 10-year-old girl who was expelled for having a knife in her lunchbox. And something such as this, you know, you wouldn't want your children to have knives at school that can in turn hurt other people. Another example was a 13-year-old boy was expelled because he brought a gun to school. That's definitely not a place where guns should be. In addition, according to an interview by S. Linton I did, 11-year-old boy was expelled. He had no diagnosis at the time. He did make several threats and attempts to other students. And they did try to make accommodations because they know he had needs and was on a wait list to get some resources. And unfortunately, the threats continued to be made and several attempts. So ultimately, he was expelled from school in order to keep everybody safe. And lastly, a middle school student brought a Swiss Army knife in his backpack to school, and he was ultimately expelled for something like this. And again, this is another reason why zero tolerance was put out, because it's to protect all individuals in school and keep them safe. Thank you, Stephanie, or Kelly.
Great, thanks, Abby. Kelly, is zero tolerance policy compatible with the BACB Compliance Code of Ethics? And if not, what could be done to make it more compatible?
Zero tolerance policy is built upon the deterrence theory, which suggests that the presence of punishment will serve to deter actors from committing future infractions. So at first appearance, this policy seems to violate the BACB Compliance Code 4.08a that behavior analysts must recommend reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible. However, the criminal behavior such as carrying weapon, threats of violence, and drug use warrants more restrictive procedures. If schools are taking other appropriate steps to reinforce positive behaviors, punishment can and should be used as a response to behaviors that put the student and their peers at risk or in danger. Zero tolerance is a response to extremely dangerous behaviors that put the safety of an entire school at risk. In compliance with Code 7.02a, if the behavior analysts believe that there may be a legal or ethical violation, they must determine whether there be a potential for harm, a possible legal violation, a mandatory reporting condition, or an agency, organization, or regulatory requirement addressing the violation. So in this case, the possession of a weapon or drug with a potential threat to human life establishes the potential for harm and a legal violation, which extends beyond the scope of applied behavior analysis. The American Psychological Association reports that parents overwhelmingly support the implementation of zero tolerance policies to ensure the safety of and the students, and feel even safer knowing that these behaviors will be dealt with quickly and in no uncertain terms. Zero tolerance is a fast-acting intervention that projects the message that major offenses are not tolerated in schools under any circumstances. This policy ensures that the behavior and safety of all students within a learning institution by eliminating the danger and fostering the positive environment for education. It ensures the safety of everyone.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Tiffany, is there any data which indicates that zero tolerance policy is having a positive effect on the school environment and the student's sense of well-being?
Great question, Crystal. According to DL Stater, after zero tolerance was enacted, the number of students who feared attack or harm at school, sometimes or most of the time, decreased from 9% in 1995 to 5% in 1999. Students aged 12 to 18 who reported avoiding certain areas of school due to safety concerns between 1995 and 1999 also decreased from 9% to 5%. This proves that zero tolerance made students' perception of safety stronger after its enactment, which is a definite success. Another immediate impact is that students in grades 9 through 12 who reported carrying a weapon on school property within the past 30 days dropped from 12% in 1993 to 7% in 1999. The percentage of students admitting to carrying a weapon in any environment during this time period also fell from 22% down to 17%. These statistics show that immediately following zero tolerance, students took the cause very seriously and increased their weapon use.
Kelly, besides the benefits of a greater sense of safety and reported decrease in students carrying weapons, are there any additional benefits of zero tolerance policies?
Yes. Zero tolerance sends a very clear message of expectations and consequences that hold students and their parents accountable for the behavior of the student. This policy gains parent attention and active involvement in their child's behavior. So not only do the consequences, such as suspension or expulsion, remove the threat from the school environment, it also allows parents to become more aware and involved in their child's life. Additionally, suspension and expulsion removes the child from the environment that likely facilitated such behavior, so the new environment can allow for rehabilitation. A recent adaptation to this policy is that schools are beginning to utilize in-school suspensions. So these in-school suspensions require students to fulfill a typical work of a school day, not allowing them to escape doing work, which can ultimately be reinforcing the behavior. Additionally, this allows the school to still play a role in the student's rehabilitation. So if a behavior warrants expulsion, a new proper school placement could be determined that may be able to better support the student. It is likely that if a student is exhibiting maladaptive behaviors, he or she is struggling in school and requires more support, and a school that specializes in special needs, emotional disturbance, and behavioral disorders can be more appropriate places for the student and provide them the support that they need. Zero tolerance policy also prepares young people for the real world, so how to exist in contemporary society. So part of socialization in today's society is understanding that for certain crimes, one is removed from society or incarcerated. This policy teaches students that the expectations held by police officers, bosses, and others of authority in society. There is zero tolerance for many aspects of life. For example, weapon use and sexual harassment. Zero tolerance develops students into law-abiding citizens. Also, zero tolerance reduces favoritism because there is no room for subjectivity. Any student who commits an act of violence or crime, as defined by the zero tolerance policy, will be held to the same consequences as that of their peers. The punishment is based upon the violation the student committed and not upon the individual. This removes bias from the process and maintains compliance with Code 1.05D that behavior analysts do not engage in discrimination against any individuals or groups. Many may argue that zero tolerance says that is not sustainable and it would require more significant changes in order to effectively improve the system. However, I would like to argue that its alternative, PBS, or positive behavior supports, is also not sustainable and would require significant changes to work effectively as well. PBS, which will be explained further later, is not really logically feasible to maintain and as a permanent fixture within the school's infrastructure as the behavior management system. PBS leads to changes in behavior, but the behaviors and attitudes are imposed on the student. Students are not involved in the process of the intervention and ultimately violates BACB Code 4.02, which is involving clients in planning and consent. PBS strips students of their independence, which violates the core principles of ABA, respect autonomy, and benefit others. Additionally, PBS is designed and implemented entirely by teachers and faculty members of whom may not be educated or properly trained to implement such designs. To improve the zero tolerance policy, all we need to do is develop an operational definition of behavior that warrants the use of zero tolerance, eliminating any non-examples, and embedding zero tolerance as a last resort or for extreme circumstances only. Areas of concern that people have of zero tolerance can be eliminated by increased standardized training for staff of how and when zero tolerance is appropriate.
Thanks, Kelly, for all of your information. As stated, the goal of zero tolerance was the reduction of violence in schools or at school-sponsored events. This goal is heroic, and more research has been done since its enactment that identifies other recommendations to combat violence at school. Authors P. Mongan and R. Walker shared 3 recommendations moving forward regarding the implementation of zero tolerance. The first recommendation is that, quote, administrators should require mens rea for expulsion. Mens rea means that the student was aware of the weapon prior to the punishment. The second recommendation is that, quote, other staff should be included in the expulsion process. This helps to determine guilt and severity of a threat without fear of being solely responsible for that decision. Making 1 or 2 staff members solely in charge of deciding a student's fate is a lot of pressure, and it can also raise questions of favoritism or prejudice towards that student. The third recommendation is to conduct a threat assessment to identify the level of homicidal threat that a student possesses. VACB Code 3.01 states that assessment must be done prior to making recommendations regarding treatment. This code should be followed when deciding consequences in school as well. These 3 recommendations can make zero tolerance as effective as it was meant to be.
Thank you, Tiffany. So now we're going to go into the counter argument to zero tolerance. So we're going to open that section with a video. Abby, would you like to introduce that video?
Yes, here's a great video from KPBS News on zero tolerance policies and their impact. Thank you, Derek and Stephanie, for letting me share.
Time when if little Johnny smacked little Jimmy in the schoolyard, he got a trip to the principal's office. Today, he could end up in the criminal justice system. Zero tolerance policies in schools are resulting in more kids landing in juvenile hall. And studies show poor minority students are getting caught in the so-called pipeline. Joining me are retired juvenile court judge James Morgan and lawyer Rick Barton, who heads the Anti-Defamation League's Education Equity Task Force. Rick, who are the students getting arrested under zero tolerance, and what are they being arrested for?
Unfortunately, 70% of those who are actually arrested under zero tolerance policies are minorities. And that's one of the issues that ADL is attempting to address. And that is the disparity between the use of law enforcement, the use of criminalization with respect to misbehavior by students of color, LGBT, and disabled children.
And what are they being arrested for?
Well, that is the arresting is only part of the problem, but they're being arrested for a much wider variety of behavior than it used to be. Zero tolerance policies had a very, very good goal, which was to eliminate drugs and guns on campus. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a much wider application to behavior such as willful defiance and other types of behavior, which quite frankly should not be criminalized, should not be the reason for arrests or referral into the juvenile justice system.
Thank you, Abby, for that video. Now we're going to have Stephanie Hoekstra, who's going to talk about zero tolerance and how it has a negative impact on students due to insufficient evidence. Stephanie?
Thank you, Derek. Zero tolerance has many issues, including lack of economical sustainability, unreasonable consequences, mistreatment of students with mental illness, disabilities, or minority students, perpetuating the school-to-prison pipeline, and even infringing upon amendments. However, there are data that proves there are successful alternatives, such as school-wide positive behavior supports. And here's some additional information from Abby.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yes, according to A Generation Later, annually, high school students with disabilities of any kind are nearly 3 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension compared to high school students without disabilities. And that number is very strong. Back to you, Stephanie.
A main issue with zero tolerance is that the consequences are not fitting for offenses. And here are some real-life scenarios from Abby.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, there are several real-life scenarios that stand out, so I'm going to share with you. The first one's coming from CBS News. A 13-year-old was suspended for wearing rosary beads, something that we might have in our home or have seen. And this would be considered gang relation type of material. And it was really from his grandparent that had passed away. Another one was a middle school boy was suspended for trying to help a suicidal friend who actually had a weapon, which was a knife in their possession, and was able to successfully take it from them and in turn save their life. But however, was in trouble for it because then they possessed a weapon, which there is no zero tolerance in schools. Another example was the ABA Journal on Zero Tolerance. A 5-year-old was suspended for having a bubble gun and talking about it because the word gun was in the sentence. But if you think about it, developmentally, a 5-year-old is supposed to be playing with bubble guns. So it's been taken a little too far. Another example was the St. Petersburg Times in Florida. An individual was suspended from school because they had a no phone policy during school hours, and they were talking to their parent that was deployed overseas in the military. According to a BCBA interview from M. Ballard, a 9-year-old female who is in a regular school with medical issues and a behavior plan with special needs, who is severely underweight, threw a chair, although was doing no harm to others, threw it out of the direction of people. She was suspended because of that. And the parents went to the school to discuss what was happened and why it occurred and see how the plan worked. And they found out that the plan wasn't being used. And they did not renew it when it came time to renew, and they withdrew the child from school ultimately because of the zero tolerance policy. Across the country, you see a use of zero tolerance that does not fit the offenses, and it's even included items you might see in your home. Some of them include pain reliever, to cough medicine, to cough drops, to even your household nail clippers. The limit goes on. And it correlates great to a statistic from the Institute of Justice. Derek, could you pull that up? According to the Institute of Justice, nationally only 5% of expulsions and out-of-school suspensions last longer than a week and actually involve the possession of a weapon, while only 43% are for insubordination. Thank you for letting me share this with you.
Yes, thank you, Abby. Another additional issue of zero tolerance is there are no positive guidelines for appropriate behavior, so it does not utilize positive reinforcement at all. This goes against Compliance Code 4.08, considerations regarding punishment procedures. A behavior analyst recommends reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible, and if punishment procedures are necessary, behavior analysts always include reinforcement procedures for alternative behavior in the behavior change program. Additionally, punishment can also be negatively reinforcing to the person implementing the punishment. And also, the consequences are just not reasonable for zero tolerance. Here is Abby with another statistic.
Thanks, Stephanie. An estimated 2 million students annually are suspended from secondary schools. As a point of reference, slightly more than 3 million students graduated high school in 2013. And this shows exactly what Stephanie was referring to. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. The overuse of aversive consequences has led to children running away or becoming aggressive. Also, schools that have low reports of disruptive behavior are not implementing zero tolerance. And here's Abby with another statistic.
Again, with a generation later, a single suspension or expulsion doubles the risk of a student will repeat a grade. And in turn, this has such lasting consequences with dropouts, limiting employment, or even lower amounts they earn. Thank you, Stephanie.
Yes. When students are expelled or suspended, they are denied access to educational opportunities. Compliance Code 4.09 states behavior analysts review and appraise the restrictiveness of procedures and always recommend the least restrictive procedures likely to be effective. And
so zero tolerance affects more than just the school setting. Regarding how zero tolerance affects the student's home life, Mongan and Walker wrote that, quote, at minimum, it could be argued that long-term suspension or expulsion would affect attachment in one of two ways. Either it could add strain to a family unit, or it could expose students to increased time in an environment that already lacks attachment. When a student is expelled, they may be sent to an environment with no support, lack of basic needs, abuse, or absentee parenting. The authors cite Terrace et al., which discusses the effects of suspension and expulsion on students and reports that, quote, children most likely to be suspended or expelled are those most in need of adult supervision and professional help. Research suggests that the use of suspension does not decrease future misbehavior and has negative consequences for the students who are suspended in their future.
Thank you. The idea that one punishment works for all misbehaviors is flawed, and we as future behavioral analysts reject this idea. One-size-fits-all approach, which fails to accommodate the fact that some of the behaviors demonstrated by students with disabilities are beyond their control, goes against Compliance Code 4.03. Behavior analysts must tailor behavior change programs to the unique behaviors, environmental variables, assessment results, and goals of each client. Many students that are not actually imposing real danger to their school environment end up being severely punished through zero tolerance. School governance and principal of each school play a large role in determining the consequences of misbehavior, rather than the student's actual behavior. This is poor treatment fidelity of zero tolerance, since it is utilized so inconsistently across the country. Zero tolerance is also not fair to students with mental illness, disabilities, or minority students. In fact, many argue that zero tolerance has become a vehicle to push unwanted students out of school. This goes against Compliance Code 7.01, promoting an ethical culture. Behavior analysts promote an ethical culture in their work and environments and make others aware of this code. Zero tolerance perpetuates the school-to-prison pipeline by punishing minor offenses and then taking students out of school and pushing them into the justice system. There is a high disparity in suspension and expulsion rates of minority students, as Black student suspension and expulsion rates are typically 2 to 3 times higher than the rates of other students. In a study by the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, it was discovered that schools enacting zero tolerance suspended almost twice as many students with disabilities than they did students without disabilities. And here's Abby with some images.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, as you've noticed, it has been disproportionate. According to the EEPA, they did a study of students suspended by race. And as you can see, there's a drastic increase in suspension of Hispanics and Blacks in comparison to any other, as you can see by the chart. And if Derek, you can turn to the next slide. And according to the Institute of Justice, among middle school students, Black youth are suspended nearly 4 times more often than white youth, and Latino youth roughly twice as likely to be suspended or expelled than whites. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Abby. This goes against Compliance Code 1.05. In their work-related activities, behavioral analysts do not engage in discrimination against individuals or groups based on age, gender, race, culture, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and etc. Zero tolerance can often be an obstruction of the 14th Amendment, which calls for due process of all American citizens. Many others claim that zero tolerance goes against the 8th Amendment as well, as zero tolerance perpetuates overly cruel and unusual punishment. This goes against Compliance Code 7.02, ethical violations of others and risk of harm. If a client's legal rights are being violated or if there is potential for harm, behavioral analysts must take the necessary action to protect the client. There are some alternatives to zero tolerance, though, such as tough as necessary, which shifts the specific focus on school violence to the broader concepts of school safety and order. This has greater balance between strong and fair, which involves collaboration with all members of the school community to establish a list of general guidelines and rules. And it includes preventative strategies and considers a broad spectrum of circumstances. Another alternative is threat assessment. This helps distinguish serious threats from minor ones and prevents unnecessary suspensions and expulsions. This is less punitive than zero tolerance. Lastly, we have the alternative of positive behavior support, which is a behavior change model that focuses on providing support to students as a preventative measure. PBS has 3 tiers, each which provides a different level of support depending on what we need. The 3rd tier focuses on individual students and includes behavior plans. PBS builds on fundamentals of ABA, which is an evidence-based program and utilizes the 3-term contingencies. PBS also utilizes various antecedent and consequence strategies to change and maintain behavior. PBS follows the BACB Code 4.03, which involves individualized behavior change programs, and this is evident in the 3rd tier. Research suggests that the use of suspension does not decrease future misbehavior and has negative consequences for the students who are suspended. So ultimately, zero tolerance goes against Compliance Code 2.09. Clients have a right to effective treatment based on research and literature and adapted to the individual client. Behavior analysts always have the obligation to advocate for and educate the client about scientifically supported, most effective treatment procedures.
All right. Thank you. Can you tell us about what kinds of measures have been taken to evaluate the effectiveness of zero tolerance policies?
Yeah. So according to author S. Martinez, while zero tolerance was enacted to keep schools safer, there have been other side effects. According to R. Wald, in 1974, 1.7 million students were suspended from school. By 1998, the number of suspended students increased to 3.1 million. This increase does not directly correlate to zero tolerance, but due to the fact that the policy was initiated between these 2 years, it is possible to assume that there is some sort of correlation. Raising suspension rates was obviously not the goal of zero tolerance. When identifying the real goal of zero tolerance as decreasing violence, it would make sense to identify murder rates in school setting. This may be the most crucial data to prove or disprove the effectiveness of zero tolerance. However, this data is inconclusive. According to authors P. Mongan and R. Walker, quote, the number of homicides at school in the 2 years before the enactment of zero tolerance was 34 and 29 students respectively. The year after zero tolerance was enacted, the student homicide rate was 34 students. Then a major decrease in student homicide occurred after the 1998-1999 year, and homicides for the 1999 to 2000 school year hit a low of 14. The authors agree that this data fluctuates too much to yield any results that are interpretable. BACB Code 1.01, Reliance on Scientific Knowledge, states that there must be reliable scientific knowledge to support any policy or procedure used with a client. Because of this, zero tolerance should not be enforced by behavior analysts because there is little to no data to support its use.
Okay, thank you everyone. So to summarize, zero tolerance is a policy which requires automatic expulsion of any student who engages in behaviors which are deemed to be a threat to school safety. Kelly argued pro zero tolerance and gave an overview of the history behind the policy, the concept of which began forming in 1980 during the War on Drugs and has continued to evolve and has expanded to include not only real weapons, but any item or action which could be perceived as a threat, such as laser pointers and written and verbal threats of violence. Kelly suggested that the policy does in fact comply with the ACB Code of Ethics because it is a response to a behavior which puts everyone at risk and therefore warrants more restrictive procedures. Although reinforcement procedures should also be used in order to be fully compliant. Tiffany shared some data which suggested that students' sense of safety has increased, while weapon carrying by students has decreased following the implementation of the policy. Supporters of zero tolerance policy like that it provides clearly defined, consistent consequences for dangerous behaviors in the school setting, and is said to be fair and unbiased, since the same rules apply to any student who breaks the rules. Tiffany shared some recommendations for improving zero tolerance policy. Next, Stephanie argued against zero tolerance policy, where she shared some problematic aspects, including lack of economical sustainability, consequences which don't fit the crime, disproportionate mistreatment of marginalized student populations, perpetuation of the school to prison pipeline, and at times infringement upon student rights. She then shared data and that support successful alternatives, such as school-wide positive behavior support. Before we conclude the debate, I'd like to pose some final questions. Is there particular research that has looked at zero tolerance policy as it relates to special education and disabilities?
It's a good question. There is a study done in Ohio in the 2010-2011 academic year indicated that learners with emotional disorders had 7.2 times increased the possibility of getting a suspension when compared to those without any disability. Moreover, the learners with cognitive incapacities have 2.5 times increased chances of getting a suspension than those without any disability.
All right, thank you. Does anyone have any personal experience related to this topic that you'd like to share?
Yes, actually, I have a colleague who previously taught in 6th and 7th middle school in an inclusion setting. The school used PBS with multi-tiered levels of intervention to support student learning and applied zero tolerance for a set of clearly defined behaviors. If a student exhibited maladaptive behavior, the behavior is defined and categorized as a minor infraction or a major infraction. This prevents the teacher from being able to simply remove the problem student from the classroom unless it's actually warranted. Once the behavior is categorized, a student reflection sheet is referenced, which I actually will pull up right now. The student reflection sheet shows the difference between a minor infraction and a major infraction, and the steps that the student will then take to improve their behavior. And if the behavior is a major infraction or is more extreme, such as possession of drugs or possession of a weapon or threats severe harm to another student, then the zero tolerance policy is enacted. She told me about an instance of a student who brought marijuana to school, which was found in his locker, which led to a 3-day in-school suspension. During the in-school suspension, the student was still required to continue full days of work as usual, only with the dean of the school. In addition to schoolwork, the student had to meet with the school counselor and the psychologist to discuss the reason for his behavior and had to research an article about how drug use led to a poor outcome and write a paper summarizing the article and reflecting on his own decisions to bring drugs to school. She told me about another student who brought an X-Acto knife from the art room. And after talking with him, they realized that he was considering suicide. And they were able to actually get him the support that he needed. So the school that she told me about utilized both PBS and zero tolerance policies in a strategic way that allowed for schools to best support the students. The teachers' responses to behaviors were clearly defined by the school, and that allowed for more certainty and it removed potential bias. Thank you, Crystal.
Great, thanks, Derek. So it's important to remember that punishment can be negatively reinforcing to the person implementing the punishment. For example, when a parent yells at a child to be quiet and the child quiets down, then the aversive stimuli of the loud child is removed from the parent. If this increases the likelihood of the parent yelling at the child in the future, then yelling is negatively reinforcing to the parent while punishing the child. Given this dynamic, what strategies can be put into place to help ensure that punishment is not overused or misused?
There are actually quite a few strategies we could utilize. One of them is providing adequate training to ensure that teachers have the tools to respond to behavior appropriately and are reinforced for responding to students appropriately. This could be done by increasing the reinforcement that teachers use in classrooms for seeing positive behavior shown and displayed by their students. And this can be shown to even prevent misbehavior and even reduce dropout and suspension rates. The positive behavior displayed by their students will be more reinforcing than the negative reinforcement that teachers experience when punishing their students. Additionally, schools can create a system so that teachers and staff are noticed and reinforced by staff for responding appropriately to behavior. Ideas such as teacher bucks, which is teachers reinforcing one another for responding to students based on function. Again, the positive reinforcement is greater than the negative reinforcement of punishing students. Schools can also train teachers in social instructional approaches so that they can help students find alternative ways to resolve conflict outside of fighting and crime. Teachers will escape the aversive consequences that result when students fight and conflict escalates. Schools can also train teachers to utilize restorative practices in their classroom. This places the responsibility for resolution on the students. Students are expected to repair the damage that they cause to the school, community, and peer-teacher relationships. This uses behavioral practices such as role-playing, feedback, and modeling. Lastly, schools can create a system which makes punishment harder to implement, like making more paperwork for suspension and expelling students. Back to you, Crystal. Tiffany.
Thank you, Stephanie. So according to the Indicators of School Crime and Safety Report, weapon possession in the total student population decreased from 12% in 1993 to 6% in 1999. That result suggests that zero-tolerance weapon policies may be an effective deterrent. This decrease in weapon possession is promising. However, when data is separated into gender, the percentage is skewed. Weapon possession only dropped from 5% to 4% for female offenders. Therefore, it is possible that this policy affects male offenders more than female offenders, which means it's not effective across all settings. Another interesting statistic refers to the percentage of students. According to P. Mongan and R. Walker, quote, from 1993 to 2009, the percentage of students injured or threatened went from 7% to 9%. These results appear to contradict the decrease in weapons, but raises the argument, does fewer weapons lead to more threats? At best, zero tolerance is not supported by data and is potentially causing more harm than good, solely based on statistics. An alternative to zero tolerance policies is for schools to take a proactive stance, focusing on the prevention of violence through comprehensive approaches to improve school climate. According to M. Lozinski, A. Katsianis, J. Ryan, and C. Bond, schools have been encouraged and supported in replacing reactive discipline plans that rely solely on negative consequences for rule infractions. Prevention approaches often address discipline on multiple levels, including A, general practices designed to prevent disruptive and violent behaviors in all students, and B, more specific practices tailored for individual students who are more likely to or have already demonstrated disruptive or violent behaviors.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. So in conclusion, the goal of zero tolerance is admirable and agreeable among most, if not all. However, implementation must be considered amongst different schools. According to Vidal Castro, quote, all school districts across the United States should revisit their zero tolerance policies. School districts should review criteria for reporting behavior issues to law enforcement, explain what constitutes a serious threat, and explain what constitutes a minor act of delinquency. Vidal Castro also recommends setting up a leadership team to focus on this form of discipline. The ACB Code 4.08 considerations regarding punishment procedures should be considered when discussing this topic. Behavior analysts recommend reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible. If punishment procedures are necessary, behavior analysts always include reinforcement procedures for alternative behavior in the behavior change program. By expelling any student through zero tolerance with little discussion of the gray area of the policy, students are being punished without any sort of reinforcement or teaching alternative behavior.
All right. Thank you to everyone who participated in this discussion on zero tolerance, its evidence, and some of its alternatives. We're going to end our debate here. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.